Now, I want to introduce another of my Stanford colleagues, Wang. Is an associate professor here in the Department of Music, and also by courtesy in computer science. He has a PhD in computer science, even though he's in the music department. He does lots of creative work. I've also had the pleasure of teaching courses with him in Beijing, lots of great stories from there. And Gu is going to be moderating this panel. We're going to look at the aesthetics and other issues of art.
Thank you, James. I'm going to keep this opening real short and just get on with the content. So to keep a lot of the lenses and ideas and perspectives from the previous panel in mind, because they will be helpful going into this one, which is entitled Good, Bad, Ugly, ? Assessing Aesthetic Value When AI Meets Art. My pleasure to welcome our next two distinguished panelists on stage. Blaise Agüera y Arcas, who's a VP Engineering Fellow, Google Research. Come on up, and Golan Levin, who is the Professor of Electronic Art and, by courtesy, Design, Architecture, and Entertainment Technology and Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. And on a personal note, Golan, I've known Golan since I was a grad student at Princeton, and I saw a talk by Golan and his work ever since, and how wonderful, quirky, weird, and playful and human they are have inspired me endlessly ever since. So it's really my pleasure. So with this, I think we're going to start with Blaise, if you would. And
thank you so much, Gu. So, all right, I'm going to whip through a few slides just by way of scene setting, I suppose, and then more importantly, have some notes that I've made during everybody else's wonderful talks this morning, which is where I want to try and spend the bulk of my 10 minutes here. So we were kind of involved in the beginnings of at least this particular phase of AI art starting in 2015 with the work of folks like Alex Morvintsev on the right, who invented a technique called Deep Dream, which some of you may remember from the kitsch era of AI art. Before things were realistic, before anybody was talking about stuff that could look in any way like it was rendered by a human being. This was pretty psychedelic. It actually gained a lot more interest from people who are interested in the effects of LSD than people who are concerned about displacement of artists' jobs. Actually, one of my earliest talks that I gave about this stuff, about Alex's work and Mike Tyka and the other sort of early pioneers of Deep Dream was right after the legalization of pot in Seattle at a symposium called Higher Education, at which everybody was supposed to get really stoned, and the theory was maybe that would make us more more conducive to to encounter higher planes of consciousness. And I think the lecture was really good, although I have to say my memory is a little bit fuzzy. So these early systems involved in a way hacking neural nets that were originally designed to do recognition of objects, and they were trained on a lot of fairly synthetic very non-artistic kinds of imagery. They were trained to recognize various kinds of objects, especially dogs, as it turns out, and then they would hallucinate these things. And there were some really kind of interesting and trippy results of this kind that ensued. When we began to see this kind of work, it seemed to us that neural nets had really turned a corner from being technologies for the analysis of media, in other words, for going from media to meaning, and started to generate media from meaning, the other way around, and that's a really interesting turning point, and that prompted us to create the Artists in Machine Intelligence program in 2016, and start to work with artists and philosophers and various other sorts of interested folks, including Golan, who's one of the early grantees, and we had lots of fun. There was this first exhibition at the Gray Area of work along these lines was really exciting, and it was a time of a lot of foment, artistic foment, I think, in a lot of ways. And there was a lot of really creative use of these technologies to do things that were unlike previous iterations of computer art, also unlike non-computer art. It really was kind of its own thing. I guess it's now like a classic of some sort. And some of that look has it will probably experience some kind of revival at some point in the future and become sort of retro-futuristic at some point. Kaoru Okumura, the Buto dancer, had a bunch of deep dream stuff projected onto her by a sort of a live 3D projector engineered by Mike Taika, who's also a very interesting visual artist and creative person in addition to being a scientist. Anyway, it was cool. And it was a very, very different conversation than the one that we are having now, because, of course, what has happened in the last several years is something that, I have to say, we predicted, in 2016, which is that starting from this sort of trippy beginnings, it would be possible for neural net outputs to become increasingly photorealistic and increasingly able to do mimesis of any sort of either natural or creative output, either in the world or by human beings, and that's exactly what we've seen happen. There were early experiments with text as well, with text and images together. Early text generation was also trippy. There was a science fiction script at some point acted out by humans, and the text was so nonsensical that it created a kind of surrealist thing that then human actors would sort of, and his eyes came out of his mouth, and the actor would like pull an eyeball out of his mouth at a certain point in this short film. This was Sunspring by Ross Goodwin. Anyway, a lot of good discussions. I also wrote this piece back in 2016, Art in the Age of Machine Intelligence, that drew the connections between this emerging field and the dawn of photography, which is a connection that we've already heard explored in some detail this morning, so I don't want to rehash it, except to point out that, while photography was certainly not just the province of scientists in the beginning, there was also very much a sharp reaction against photography by fine artists in the 19th century, and it had a lot of the same kinds of vibe of the discussions that we see today. Walter Benjamin got very involved in this discussion because, at that time we were talking about democratizing the means of reproduction of art and reproduction of the world, which in turn affected the economics of the situation. Of course, Benjamin was a Marxist, and he had a lot to say, both about how people make their livelihoods and also about the aura or the socioeconomic status that rich people get by putting original paintings up on their walls. And there was, sort of both democratization and livelihood discussion that ensued that in many ways is very parallel to the one that we're having now. Now, the difference, of course, is that painting reacted in a way that pulled it away in large part from photography. Of course, there were still photorealistic painters after this time, but they were making a statement with their photorealism in a way that painters who were striving for visual realism, like, say, Vermeer, before had not been making a statement. And there were highly non-photorealistic painters, so Cubism, modernism, et cetera, also sprang from this revolution in a sort of in an opposite direction. So it changed the course of things, both for traditionalists and for revolutionaries, and it's not even clear who was the revolutionary really. And it gave rise to new media. In many ways, the real progeny of photography was the kind of medium that wasn't possible to do before we started to fix images on film, which was cinema. So, one of the really interesting questions that I think is worth asking is, beyond Mid-Journey making things that look like the sort of illustrations that we do today, what are the forms of art that become possible with AI that did not exist, not just the mimesis of existing art forms? That's maybe an interesting thing for us to look at. I also want to point out that we've talked a lot about visual media. All media are subject to the same kinds of mimesis. This is a paper from our group from 2022, Audio LM. I can actually play a short clip of mimesis using Soundstorm. This was published just a couple of days ago to give you a little bit of a sense of the realism, if you like, in the auditory domain, where we are maybe a little bit less used to this stuff. There's been a lot of visual material in the public imagination, the Mid-Journeys, and so on. A lot less attention paid to audio. So this is just a couple of seconds of two people saying something. There's a person saying something, another person responding to that person, and the rest of it is entirely synthetic. You'll hear the prompt, which is essentially what it is first, and then you'll hear the computer continue. If I didn't tell you, of course, where the gap is between the real and the synthetic, I think it would be very difficult for you to hear where it is. Here we go.
Where did you go last summer?
I went to Greece. It was amazing.
Where did you go last summer?
I went to Greece. It was amazing.
Oh, that's great. I've always wanted to go to Greece. What was your favorite part?
It's hard to choose just one favorite part, but yeah, I really loved the food. The seafood was especially delicious, and the beaches were incredible. We spent a lot of time swimming, sunbathing, and exploring the islands.
Well, that sounds like a perfect vacation. I'm so jealous.
It was definitely a trip I'll never forget.
I really hope I'll get to visit someday.
So it's a banal conversation. There's nothing of interest going on here except the fact that the mimesis is nearly perfect. So in this sense, we're at a Turing test passing sort of moment. There are even things about the accents of those people that seem to have been inferable from just those few seconds of conversation that I'm not even sure a human that are accurate, in fact, that I'm not even sure a human actor could have guessed.
Was that Matt?
Yes, it was.
So I can recognize in person.
Exactly, and you hear certain things about Matt's accent that again weren't necessarily evident from those 3 seconds. So in any case, pretty interesting moment. It's not the beginning for this kind of stuff. So one AI composer whose work I've been following for many years, he lives not far from here, David Cope, started to do algorithmic composition in the 1980s, so a long time before the current generation, and his work, he is a serious composer and also a programmer who began to use sort of techniques in grammar to compose while he was struggling with composer's block. For an opera that he was, so he spent years then sort of on a sidetrack writing code, and then finally composed his opera in a few minutes with the output of the code that he had spent the last several years writing. And he's done a lot of algorithmic composition since, and he attracted the ire of the music community with his work. A lot of people said, your stuff is too good, it's bullshit. We think that you're writing it yourself. And this is a Wizard of Oz trick, to which he responded by putting on his website, which definitely has some GeoCities sort of vibes, a zip file with 5,000 Bach chorales composed by the thing. Is like, okay, mic drop. Nobody can compose 5,000 Bach chorales, even if we kind of know how to do it in music class. So that sort of shut the critics up. But it's remarkable to me how little known David Cope and his work are, given how important I think this conversation was, and what profound questions it raises about things like value and compensation and so on in composition. At the same time, it's interesting that we haven't seen algorithmic composition of this sort, the electronic mariachi, as it were, taking over in composition land, and I think that has to do with some of the issues that Doug just raised. So. So this is my last slide. I just want to say a couple of other things. My own background, is originally as a sort of physics and math person and a computer scientist, also a writer and someone who loves art and music. And a musician. I certainly have a great deal of privilege in the sense that I don't have to make my living through my art. I have other means of subsistence, and that puts me in quite a different spot from the panelists in the previous session. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that. I also. In our group, one of our big concerns has been civil liberties and privacy and its intersection with machine learning, as well as socio-technical systems more broadly. There are many ways of abusing AI in ways that limit civil liberties and that involve limitations of people's freedom of action and surveillance, and those things concern us very much. And there are a lot of really interesting technical approaches that one can use to mitigate aspects of that. One of my proudest achievements from the team over the last decade has been the invention of federated learning, which is all about how one trains machine learning models without memorizing the training data. And this is extremely relevant, I think, when it comes to training models, for instance, that generalize about media without quoting or without reproducing specific works. There's a whole technical side to this discussion that we certainly don't have time to go into in any detail here, but I think those aspects are very interesting. A lot of the discussion that I feel like we are having here is political in nature. And touches on a lot of other issues to do with, for instance, capitalism and redistribution. Ezra Klein and Ted Chiang, I think, have made some very, very important points about the fact that often when we're having a fear response to AI or talking about it, we are really talking about corporations and capitalism and other conditions that are larger than the matrix of just what is happening in art or in creativity. And I think it's important for us to widen the frame to talk about those things and not just specifically about art, because many of the debates take on a very different tenor if we zoom out in that way. And I think that's important to do. I'm seeing neo-Luddite mailing lists and groups and reading lists, that include, in some cases, pieces that I've written. Long-termists having their own very different discussion, and existential risk people, Zapatistas, and I really enjoyed those talks in the previous session. Thank you, Steve, for articulating that. And also a lot of anxieties about human exceptionalism. We talk consistently about these models as being just tools, as not being agential, as not being really intelligent, not being able to understand, just parroting. In my experience, and coming at this as a computational neuroscientist and somebody who's been very interested in brains for a long time, I don't think that that's accurate. I think that there are actually some very profound parallels between what we've been figuring out using sequence models and what the brain likely does, or what large parts of the brain likely do. And I think that if we roll forward by a little bit and we start to imagine what life is going to be like in, say, 2030, which is not very long from now, we are not only going to be talking about a world in which a lot of the basic premises on which things like capitalism and redistribution and so on are thrown into question, but also in which there are not only a lot of AI tools, but a lot of AI agents in the world that we interact with in ways that are in many ways indistinguishable from the ways that we interact with other people. It's very, very difficult to take the total derivative and understand what that kind of world looks like. When we take a partial derivative, that is to say, we imagine everything else staying constant, and we just say, okay, copyright law, now we continue and extrapolate. Or, we hold constant the fact that computers are just tools, and then we go and we see what that results in. Or we say disinformation, what happens then? We don't realize that everything else will have changed as well. In all of these previous revolutions, print, the emergence of the computer, there were a lot of predictions predicated on holding all variables constant except one that turned out to be, if not wrong, extremely partial. In this kind of everything, everywhere, all at once sort of universe in which all of the variables change, we need to unblock ourselves from thinking only about those partial derivatives. I should stop at this point. I think I've gone on a little bit too long. Golan?
Thanks so much, Blaise, and thanks so much, Agüera, and thanks so much to the organizers for having me here today, and thanks to all of you. I'm keenly aware that I'm between you and lunch, so I'm going to try and keep this nice and tight. As a quick question for the group, I'm just curious, since I have a couple hundred people in front of me, how many of you are wearing an article of clothing that's handmade? I count, okay, not jewelry, let's say, not jewelry. I see one hand. I'm afraid, to kind of talk what Stephen Zapata was talking about earlier, I'm afraid that, we could be looking at a future where the bulk of the kind of creative imagery, or the bulk of the imagery that we see is sort of mass-produced like that, and I worry that we're heading there. The organizers of this event entitled this particular panel on aesthetics, Good, Bad, and Ugly, and I think the Edges to Catch tool manages to be all three. But more seriously, in the first half of this talk, I'm going to discuss three of my own projects that use AI and which have been described by other people as using these terms, good, bad, and ugly. And this may also reveal kind of a complicated relation to my own work as well. And the second half of the presentation is going to be a sort of dense philosophical sort of exhortation to keep things weird. The kind of thing I might tell my new media art students at Carnegie Mellon. And to be clear, I'll be speaking today about aesthetics, the sort of what's worth making and why, as long as we're doing the making aspect of AI art. And I will not be directly addressing the mostly unfortunate impacts that AI art is having on traditional arts practices and their economies, although I think it's clearly on our minds today. But let's get started. I need to learn how to adjust this. Is the middle button? Oh, I see this one. Okay, here. Okay, cool. Hey, there it goes. So the first project I'd like to show is the good one. I mean good here in the sort of lawful good sense of D&D, in line with sort of Alison Parrish's remark that art is the only ethical application of AI. Although really interestingly, I think we're turning a corner on that one too. Maybe it's no longer the only ethical application of AI. This project was a 4-year collaboration with the Teenie Harris Archive at the Carnegie Museum of Art, the museum down the street from my university. And at this museum, a team of archivists have been working for years to label and organize the life's work of Charles Teenie Harris, one of the foremost photojournalists of the documenting 20th century African American life. He took over 80,000 photographs in a career spanning 4 decades. Unfortunately, he was functionally illiterate, and many thousands of his photographs lacked metadata. So we collaborated with the museum to produce sort of AI-powered software tools to help their archivists' annotation work, and along the way we produced a kind of interactive installation that you see here that made the collection visible to the public in new ways. As many of the people in the photographs are ancestors of people in Pittsburgh, it becomes kind of a family album for my city's black community. And so here it is shown in the museum's new Teenie Harris Gallery. So lawful good projects like this get supported, get grants from the NEH and get featured on my university's homepage. Media theorist Nabil Hussain has eloquently and with excellent justification argued against black inclusion in facial recognition, and I'm hoping that perhaps this project is one worthy exception. And here it's using AI techniques, but not generative ones in terms of synthesizing new Teenie Harris images, if whatever that would mean, but rather using analytical techniques to kind of understand the data set in order to return some kind of value back to the commons, to the public, and to the community. Okay, so the next project, I'm proud of it, but it's also kind of bad, and good, bad, and ugly, right? I mean this kind of in a moral sense in ways that weigh on me, and I have to own that. It's a box, you put your hand in it, you see your hand with an extra finger. The Augmented Hand series is a real-time interactive artwork that presents playful and uncanny transformations of its visitors' hands. These transformations operate within the logical space of the hand itself, altering the deep structure of how one's own hand appears. Many young visitors, uncertain of whether or not to believe their eyes, peek inside to make sure their hand hasn't really changed. And I love this. The instrument defamiliarizes our own bodies. It suggests other ways of being. It incites a dreamlike re-examination of ourselves. It muddles embodied cognition. But as I learned the hard way, it also can be painfully othering, and it was so for one particular museum goer with a different hand. Art can make us feel all sorts of ways, but I don't like the idea that one of my artworks made someone feel bad about themselves. Art can be bad too, and I have to kind of own that. And I guess it's unusual for an artist to come up and say, like, I made this thing that was lousy, but yeah, it can happen. Finally, the ugly. Here we go. All right, so the art critic Yanagi Soetsu proposed that all art somewhere has an element of the grotesque. Here in this project, it's centered. This monstrosity is an ambigram that is, or an image that's legible as a face, in this case, whether seen from one direction or the other. Try it. It's one of 55 such ambigrammatic faces that I generated. Helena Sarin, the artist, has remarked that creativity is curiosity plus courage. Neither is something that AI, I think, in itself can possess. But an artist can or can try. These faces represent the endpoint of my curiosity. Could AI, as a tool, help me generate patterns that were inherently two-faced? And if so, what would they look like? This was the answer to the question. Unexpectedly, my custom GAN inexorably produced January 6 insurrectionists as the optimal solution to this visual problem, which, if you think about it, sort of makes sense, because you need hair on one side and or like a beard on the other. Okay. In the 18th century, bivalent face illusions were often used to depict seemingly uncomplicated dualities, such as young, old, male, female, or good, wicked. Perhaps the faces in this series reflect the ambiguities of a more uncertain time, marked by duplicity and identitarianism. The results are, correctly speaking, grotesque. It takes a certain gameness, I don't want to say courage exactly, but gameness to allow an artwork to be itself, even if the results of one's efforts are ugly. So there you have some good, some bad, some ugly. In the remainder of my time, I'm going to offer some provocations regarding aesthetics and AI-generated art. In 1965, Max Bense outlined the goal of generative art: to accelerate our ability to produce deviations from the norm. Essentially, an artist makes a system to probe aesthetic possibilities that they couldn't themselves predict. Vera Molnar called her generative drawing programs machines for serendipity. The computational poet Alison Parrish, who I mentioned earlier, has called her poetry generators cute robot explorers for semantic space. We artists, bottom feeders on the arcane debris of the tech revolution, have adapted AI, the ultimate apparatus of surveillance and social control, to instead probe the outer quantiles of aesthetic experience. Around us, however, the opposite is now happening. Here's a fungible, nugatory image, one of the less offensive AI artworks that come up on the first page of Google results. The author of this statistically likely artwork in his license field spells out its value. It's AI generated, he writes, so do whatever you want with it. Thank you, I'll debase it in a public talk. I'm not sure the kitsch era of art is over. I do miss the puppy slugs. 60 years on, with seemingly all of visual history encoded in data sets like Leon 5B, we are all pulling from this same distribution. And we know what happens when that happens. The increasing adoption of AI is accelerating a race to the middle. As Kyle Chayka has pointed out, the algorithmic feeds of social media have pushed content creators to conform to the acceptable average. AI generation will just automatically produce that average from the start, pushing us into an era of average garbage forever. In his essay, Defining AI Art's Three Proposals from 2019, Lev Manovich explains that many people define art created by an AI as something that arts professionals recognize as valid historical art. Thus, the achievements of AI art during the last 6 decades are convincing simulations of historical art created before the AI art making started. By this retrograde definition, AI art is not capable of executing the main strategy of contemporary art, which is constantly expanding what counts as art. So, we have to shatter this. Straightforwardly, AI can be used in processes, situations, and performances that expand the definition of art and make us feel something new. I think the Two Circles robot by Madeline Gannon does this really joyously, but there are plenty of other approaches too. And if we're image makers, we must cultivate and vigorously protect our ability to work outside of corporate tools, which are only ever designed, anyway, to support the creation of familiar things that we've seen before. One of my favorite AI artworks of all time is a collection of dreamlike leaves that Helena Sarin created in 2017. Crucially, she created these by training a self-made GAN on 1,000 images of leaves that she collected from her own backyard. A deeply personal AI practice that seems almost quaint now in our era of stupendously large, ready-made data sets of dubious provenance. So, photorealism is an inevitable and perennial, predictable, and frankly unimaginative goal that's common in technical circles. I don't prefer it, but let's talk about it. Can we do it in a way that is imaginative? And with these commercial tools like Midjourney and so forth, I do welcome the unexpected new forms of creative practice that they make possible and the new creative voices operating there. I see it in the collisions of text and image that underpin prompt work like Nuclear Explosion Gender Reveal Party or Kermit the Frog Testifies Before Congress, 1953. These are the products of a dialogue between critical imaginations and a sophisticated tool of unknown potential, and they reflect unique human perspectives. I'm not fascinated with the tech, I'm fascinated by our ability to find unexpected ways of using it. In the really great article, Why AI Will Never Write a Great Song, Nick Cave explains that part of what moves us in appreciating art is not just its specific perceptual patterns, but our kinship, awe, or empathy with the artist who made it. For Cave, art cannot be separated from the person who made it, and what makes an artwork good or compelling is more than just what it looks like. Related to what Stephen talks about earlier with bespoke art that's sort of tuned for us, Cave talks about the same thing, sort of art that's biometrically adapted to our current needs at that moment. And it might be good, he says, but it will never be a great song because we don't relate to Kurt Cobain, sitting there, or Nina Simone crying. There is a new kind of creative voice, absurd and charming, who is using AI, and it's a person's voice that guided the otherworldly post-photography of a sawdust store. It's a person's voice, it's funny, and I'm here for them. And I see it in this ecstatic fantasy, Billionaires at La Tomatina Festival. this and the other previous works, as modest as they may be, are a new type of product of human activity, human desire, and human critical understanding, empowered by a new slingshot for the mind. I think they point towards the conclusory definition of AI art, which Lev Manovitz posits in his previously mentioned article. AI art, he writes, is a type of art that we humans are not able to create ourselves because of the limitations of our bodies, brains, or other constraints, but which, as all great art before, expands our creative potential as humans. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, but we're going to go to one first from the external live stream. Tracy asks, assessing the aesthetic value of art is fraught even without AI disruption. Some artists are labeled outsiders. Is AI-generated art outsider art?
Some of it is, sure. I mean, I was looking at these folks I'm working on Reddit, you know, and crediting them in my talk. And I think, you know, I teach in an art school, and so, like, you know, what is art is either a topic that's up for discussion or just, like, not even worth talking about. And, you know, an artist is somebody who makes art, and art is something that's made by an artist, and if you call it art, then it's art. I welcome new forms of creative practice. I welcome new careers that don't have names yet. I welcome new forms of creative practice that don't have names yet. And if they're bubbling up by outsiders, as we might call them, almost pejoratively, institutionally, I think, not in a good way, you know, because they're popping up on Reddit and they have some kind of funny handle instead of, you know, a gallery representation. I'm okay with that.
I would. So yes, to everything you just said. I would also say that there are some things that are rather sick about artistic practice and the community as it exists today. It's sick that you know, the great artworks of dead painters are, you know, in storage facilities, you know, being used as investments. It's sick that that international art English and that a certain form of post-structural theory, you know, has sort of colonized, you know, something that is fundamentally human and belongs to all of us. And it's sick that the distribution of gains from doing art have the Pareto shape that they do. You know, it was kind of lovely to visit, you know, Avignon in the south of France a few years ago and see, like, the kind of street art fairs and you know, the way cities like that fund, you know, art in an extraordinarily generous way that feels completely alien to the American context. So, you know, I feel like those things distort, you know, a lot of these conversations in weird ways.
I was saying earlier to Ge that, like, the normalizing pressures of capitalism, the normalizing pressures of institutions, of which I'm myself an exponent, you know, sort of shape what we think art is, and you know, because of what will succeed within these systems. But art can be so much more, and I welcome that.
It seems to be a running theme, you know, from this panel and before, of, like, actually getting back to this very question of, like, what the hell is art? To begin with, I like yours, like, maybe it's not worth talking about because, you know, if, I don't know, like, any given day, I'm just like, art is maybe something that humans try to do and mostly fail. They try to understanding themselves and their emotions. And other days, I'm thinking something else. I think this is interesting that kind of both of you address kind of this almost like this kitsch dimension of AI, going back to, like, something like Deep Dream, which it did feel kitschy, which one might define as something of, like, an aesthetic content that seems to apparently lack sophistication or critical kind of, you know, imagination. And Golan, you made this comment that I'm not sure if we're out of the kitsch era of AI either yet. And I'll throw one more idea in there, and I think this all has to do with kind of how do we think about this content that is the product of artificial intelligence systems. My students, I sometimes have been thinking, like, is this fan fiction? You know, I mean, like, it's really, like, it's not what you call canon, but it's kind of something that's been trained on a lot of kind of human-produced things. Now it's, you know, and fan fiction has, I'm not saying this in any way to say fan fiction has no value at all, quite the opposite, but I am identifying fan fiction possibly as a different kind of thing from, I don't know, like, whatever it's a fan fiction, whatever it's a fan of. But I'm wondering, I'll just throw that out there. I'm not sure if there's a question there, but let that be a prompt. I wonder what either of you think about that.
I'll just, a brief reply. I mean, like, my students, and even to a certain extent myself, we would like to use AI tools to make nice images that we can sell as NFTs, and this is, participating in this economy and blah, blah, blah. And then, I have a whole other part of my heart where, I know it's just terrible. And then, this is where I'm just like, I'm reevaluating what I'm making, even how I'm making it, what I'm making it with. And like, I identified a list of 5 directions that would just be really interesting for future art. They are the ephemeral, undocumentable, unscalable, inefficient, and unmarketable. And I'm like, yeah, that's like, I kind of want to go there. And I think AI can play a role in those, but not the role that we've been talking about today, not whether in terms of its threat to what we make or the opportunities it presents.
Yes. I guess another thing that I would add is, and maybe I will out myself with a controversial statement here, but I tend to think about the more than human quite a bit. Not only AI, not only the things that are new, the noosphere, but other natural systems. I don't see technologies as separate from human. I don't see any of those as separate from nature. When I look at beauty as it has been manifested in natural systems, I don't see a discontinuity between that and the things that we make. So, this puts me, I guess, in company like James Lovelock, James Bridle, Jane Bennett, Tim Morton, and that perspective, I think also highlights the way our, maybe this makes me more of a lumper than a splitter, but it also highlights the way our own kind of economic systems and the way we think about value and prestige and all of this kind of stuff is very, very local, provincial, and contingent. I mean, in a way, I find that the kitsch, more than I find the identification of this or that form of aesthetics to be kitsch, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you both very much. And Golan actually answered a question I might have asked, which is how would you recommend that we keep AI art weird? And I think you just answered. Thank you very much. We'll now go to a question from Bob on live stream. How do you feel about a hypothetical model trained to value the aesthetic quality of artworks based on experts' opinions?
Not very interesting, but doable, I guess. Like, go ahead, train it up. Go for it.
Yeah.
There you have it, Bob.
Sorry, Bob. I mean, go for it, man.
Okay,
NFT for the win.
looks like a question in the back, that gentleman in the blue. Yes, your mic will be coming to you.
I think it'll reify the same biases that we're trying to get away from. There you go.
Thank you for very insightful comments. We heard earlier that the 3 C's, credit, compensation, and consent are critical. So can we extend that conversation of aesthetic value to economic value? And how can we first assess the right economic value for the art, which is generated by AI, based on the work from the original artists, right? And how do we make sure we compensate the artist based on that value?
I think that, again, I tend to think fairly collectivistically about a lot of these sorts of things. The social scientist Robert Merton wrote about multiple simultaneous discovery many years ago, and it turns out that some multiple simultaneous discovery has been multiply simultaneously discovered as well many times. The idea being that it doesn't matter what innovation or what original idea we are talking about, whether it's cubism or the light bulb or what have you. There's this uncanny property in which many people around the same time suddenly come up with the thing. And when you start to zoom out a little bit and look at the whole noosphere, if you like, you begin to realize that every one of those is like a chemical reaction that has certain precursors. You can't have a light bulb if you don't know how to blow glass and draw metal out and create a vacuum or a partial vacuum and so on. And it's the same thing with artistic movements and ideas and with individual works as well. They all exist in kind of this fractal object of the adjacent possible. And in that sense, I mean, some of it obviously is extraordinarily labor intensive and involves an individual person going inward for a long time and doing something, but it never happens in isolation. It's always part of this much, much larger social fabric, or socio-naturo-technical fabric, if you like. And I think that acknowledging that that's the thing that we're talking about may change the terms of our discussion about the three C's in certain ways. But it can't change those terms under conditions in which, for instance, food, shelter, health, education, and so on are contingent on doing labor that needs to be compensated at a market price, et cetera. Like, it feels to me like there are certain things that have to shift in order for that conversation to find its natural footing, if that makes sense.
Anything to add?
I knew that if I came over down here to Sand Hill Road, that I get questions like, how can we make money off of this? Or how can the people that we're stealing from get the micro pennies so that they can make some money off of the money that we're making off of them? And I feel privileged that I do have a job, that doesn't, it's not on my back that I have to do this. And also privileged to be in the panel about aesthetics. I guess the question I would propose is, can we imagine a world without capitalism or other alternatives to it that where we don't have to ask these questions?
Okay, so question here. Yes.
Hi. I was really interested in the history project that you did with the photos and how to use AI to create sort of a collective sense of belonging. But I'm curious how you set guardrails around your work in order to prevent it being reproduced and copied in ways that you're not able to control. Second part of that question is, you mentioned you want to work outside kind of corporate tools in order to be able to do that. How do you think about accessibility of AI art for people that aren't able to work outside these easily accessible tools? Thank you.
A lot of questions there, and it's almost lunchtime, so I'm going to try and really blast through that. So the project that I did with the museum, I was really blessed to work with curators who had really responsible workflows and procedures for dealing with cultural data. So I worked within parameters that they set, and that was actually a relief because I was handling 80,000 photographs of African Americans from Pittsburgh, many under really difficult circumstances of production and capture. And it was great to work with experts in the field and have kind of the protection of a cultural institution that was sensitive to this material and to teach me how to be sensitive to it as well. As far as protecting my own material, like apart from that, I mean, I've been ripped off so many times. I'm just kind of like used to it. If you make something interesting enough, you should just expect that you have a limited amount of time to kind of before somebody else is going to copy it, and probably make more money on it than you. At least in my case, I've missed so many of these financial opportunities. Don't even want to list them all. The last question is about access and education in AI. I mean, Helena Sarin did that nice thing with the leaves where she was training her own GAN, but she was training it with a data set that she made. And I was really sad to see like Runway ML recently sort of quietly retire one of the few resources that a student could use without programming to train a GAN on their own data set, right? Because it's like, it wasn't in their business interest. They're focusing on these big models that they can, provide access to. I think the Processing Foundation points a way towards, providing tools for the public and for new learners, especially learners in the arts, so that they can develop access to and, computation. Machine learning is still coming. ML5 project, which is sort of affiliated with the Processing Foundation, is sort of close. I mean, Camille and I teach with these tools and I'm sure some of you do as well in your other universities. So I would say I see artist-led initiatives to make tools available. Gene Kogan with the ML4A a few years ago. Artists making tools available for other artists to kind of help them bootstrap and develop literacy and even creative power with these tools. I
feel like we're in a similar era to early computing. a little bit before the personal computer in that there are barriers. At the same time, the equivalents of the homebrew computer club are already there as well. When you look at models like, Llama leaking and, the fact that, I don't know, a desktop can run, a 64 billion parameter model, no problem. I feel like for better and worse, democratization is coming. Also, these models are very good at coding. And that too will be democratized. So the idea that you have to be technical to use them, I think, is has a very short expiration date. I don't expect that will be true at all by the decade's end.
I'll give a hot take. I shouldn't say this, but really shouldn't. This is gonna smart for somebody, but I will say, I teach at a very technological R1 university, similar to Stanford, and people who are in STEM fields have a certain strut about the jobs that they're going to get. And I'm on the other side of campus, and we see that strut. And it was, I think...
The comeuppance will be nice, won't it?
It was nice to see ChatGPT code really well.
Yeah.
It does.
Golan, I was going to say this too. Like, if artists are concerned about their livelihood, I mean, I understand because artists make, for the most part, so much less money than people who code nowadays.
Yeah.
But the reality about job displacement, if you want to think about it that way, is that programmers are up for a much bigger fall.
Bruce Sterling has remarked. He says, "Whatever happens to musicians will happen to all of us," and I think that's a good lesson for here.
Yeah.
Way to go, Silicon Valley. Way to go, Stanford. So running up on time, first of all, I want to confess that I'm one of the people that try to rip Golan Levin off in the past. He's been so hugely inspirational. I want to leave maybe this with a question for questions. There's no way we have any time to actually answer this following question, but it's a question on behalf of all of us. And it gets back to this panel on assessing aesthetic values when it comes to AI meeting art. And it actually has to do with something that we're talking about here, and it's, on one hand, it's displacement. On one hand, it's just looking at the value of things that we make and the things we make. Right? And so it has to do with kind of this idea of the Turing trap and this idea that we've all touched on, but I don't think we drilled in on. So it's the idea that, kind of maybe perhaps ever since the Turing test, kind of this idea of making AI as indistinguishable as possible from humans have kind of more than dominated as kind of perhaps the only benchmark of progress, or at least there's a view that that may be the case. And so it almost is like taking for granted that as long as, Midjourney can do things that humans can do well, then that's a good system. So this gets back to this question of what does good actually mean in that good, bad, and ugly? I know there's no time to answer this, but I was wondering if the two of you could leave us with some questions that we could ask ourselves when thinking about AI and art.
I do have a perspective on this. I don't think that the Turing trap is quite what we think it is. There is a sense in which the things that we have done with AI systems are human-centric, in that, for instance, the text is. I mean, text is text, right? The huge majority of text, online at this point has been written by human beings, although I'm sure that will not be the case in a few years' time. When we train with images, we're training with RGB images that are, our own, the cones in our own eyes and so on. Nonetheless, when you're asking for images of trees or of other natural forms, that's not really, to say that that's the human world is to construe the human world in a fairly broad sense. What AI really is doing is modeling distributions, whatever those distributions happen to be. And it so happens that the distributions that they're being pre-trained on today are mostly generated by human beings or human beings pointing cameras and what have you. But that set will expand greatly over time. And that ability to do mimesis is extremely general. And it's the same thing that we do with each other. I mean, I think that's what cultural evolution is, and the modeling of beings of each other, which is the origins of intelligence, period. So, I see the Turing test in a broader sense as being about modeling others, whatever those others happen to be, and whatever is doing the modeling.
Thank you, Blaise.
And just to kind of, you set me up to make the main point of my talk again, which is just that if we're modeling distributions, let's remember to go check out, the farms.
tails.
The tails, yeah.
Amen.
Okay, so maybe with that, let's join me in thanking our panelists one more time.